Okay, so yeah, it should be due tonight for chapter 10. Any, no issues yet with 17, though you probably haven't looked at it yet, that's okay. Okay, well, I hit record and we'll get going. Today's everybody's favorite topic to talk about, the reproductive system, right? It's important to know that we're just talking about anatomical parts today. This is just biology, right? So that's good to know as we move forward. This week, we're talking about the reproductive system and then pregnancy. And then on Wednesday, we do this cool lab that we kind of simulate what it's like with like fetal alcohol syndrome a little bit. We look at an egg, like a chicken's egg, that's been in some alcohol. And we're going to see what it does to the egg, essentially. All right, so that's pretty cool, because we're talking about, you know, drugs and personal health and things like that. That kind of combines both. All right, today, anatomical things about the reproductive system, okay? It says points to ponder. What you should be able to do is label the anatomy and the functions of each of the structure in the male as well as the female, which will be on the second half of this slide, the slideshow here. There won't be a picture per se on the exam, but there won't be a picture on the exam by any means, but maybe if it said, what are some parts of the female reproductive system and what are their functions? Be able to say that, okay? Making sure that we're saying things in detail and making sure that the importance is explained, okay? We're going to list the components of semen. We're going to explain the male sexual response, trace the pathway of sperm through the man's body or the male's body, and what are the treatments for common male reproductive disorders. Okay, so you've probably all had a biology class in high school or a health class before. We're talking about first the male reproductive system and then second the female reproductive system. So this is located in the pelvic girdle. Okay, the pelvic girdle is essentially what some people like to call the hip bones. All right, so we're looking at the bottom part of the vertebrae here, the urinary bladder, okay, and then the scrotum is down here. All right, this is just to give you a little sense of where we are located. Some of the main parts of the male reproductive anatomy, these are the external reproductive organs. So these are the parts of the male reproductive anatomy that are on the outside of the body, okay? So some internal reproductive organs we'll talk about in a couple of slides. Other internal organs are things like your stomach, your small intestine, your large intestine. Those are internal organs. These are external reproductive organs. So they are on the outside of the body. This is the penis and the scrotum, which is the sacs that hold the testes. The external male genitalia, it's a little fun fact here, about 60% of the US males are circumcised and 15% worldwide. This is the difference between a uncircumcised and a circumcised penis. There's different religious beliefs, personal beliefs, morals, values, whatever behind this. Usually circumcision is due to preventing infection, but it's not a requirement by any means. Most of the time it's done in infants when they're first born. The human penis is used for sexual intercourse and urination. So the circumcision is when the removal of the foreskin is on the outside there, and then this is composed of 3 cylinders of spongy erectile tissue, okay? The scrotum, on the other hand, the testes of the humans and many mammals, they're held on the outside of the abdominal cavity, and this is important because of the temperature, okay? Does anybody know what the inside of your body's normal temperature is? If you were just a normal day, what's the body's temperature?
Like 97.8.
Close, yeah, 96.8. So 97 would be considered normal as well. So anywhere in that range is considered normal. So production of normal sperm cannot occur at body temperature, which is why the testes and the scrotum are not an internal organ. They are on the outside of the body for temperature regulation.
okay? The scrotum helps regulate the temperature of the testes. The outside temperature is lower than in the abdominal cavity. Okay, so your abdominal cavity is kind of like where your small intestine, your large intestine, your stomach, that's considered your abdominal cavity. People kind of refer to that as like your abs, right? I guess some of us can, not me. The climate control system. Okay, so this is a way that evolutionarily in humans for the sperm production to have regulated body temperature and creation of sperm is so that it's on the outside of the body and not on the inside. So here's a little bit about some of the different parts of the reproductive system. You have the vas deferens, which is essentially a long tube that essentially communicates between the testes and the penis itself. You have the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland. You've maybe heard of like prostate cancer before. We've talked about that a little bit, and you maybe realized that it was in males, but you maybe didn't realize where it was located. That's the prostate gland. The bulbourethral gland, which is just inferior to the prostate gland. You have the urethra, the penis, and the epididymis. The testes are what is where the sperm is essentially created. And then the vas deferens is the long tube in which the sperm and the urine essentially are expelled out of the penis. The testes, these consist of many highly coiled tubes surrounded by several layers of connective tissue. And if you look at that previous slide, the picture on the bottom right shows those highly coiled tubes with connective tissue. We know about connective tissue, we've talked about it before. Sperm are produced within the semi-inferius tubules of the testes, and they are stored and matured in the epididymis. Okay, so let's go back to where we are here. So they're created in the testes, but stored in the epididymis, which is kind of right above that, connected to the vas deferens. Okay. The vas deferens and the urethra kind of work together. So during ejaculation, sperm are propelled through the muscular vas deferens. So yes, the muscles transport the sperm to the urethra, and they exit the penis through the urethra that transports sperm out of the body. Okay? Sperm's main goal in life is to pass on genetic information, and it is to essentially fertilize an egg in order to do that. That's the sperm's goal, okay? And we know from a couple of chapters ago, we were talking a little bit about how females are born with all of the eggs that they will have throughout their life, but they mature post-puberty. So with males, they create millions and billions of sperm throughout their life, and the main goal is to pass on genetic information. Bless you. So the semen is the fluid that is ejaculated from the penis. 95% of it is just secretions. 5% of it is the actual sperm, which makes up 200 to 500 million sperm in one ejaculation, which is a lot of sperm. And we're talking about a certain number of eggs in a female, and now we're talking millions of sperm in an ejaculation of a penis, okay? So the reason behind this is it's kind of like when you're going to the casino, right? If you take in $2 and that's all you've got, I mean, we could probably all relate to that. You go in, you're going to test your luck, right? But if you went in with $200 million into a casino, you're probably going to have a lot of fun, right? Well, fun is subjective. You're going to maybe have more chances to win money, okay? But in this case, essentially with the sperm, there's so much created because it wants to increase its odds. It wants to be able to pass on that genetic information. And because eggs are so essentially selective, is I guess another way you could say it, or rare, having more sperm allows for the possibility or the higher probability of passing on that genetic information. And it's that amount of stuff that we just talked about is about 5 milliliters or approximately 1 teaspoon. 3 sets of accessory glands add secretions to the semen. And these are those accessory glands and what they add. So the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and the I usually can say this right, I'm sorry. Bulbourethral gland, excuse me. A pair of seminal vesicles contribute to about 60% of the total volume of semen. They produce a sugary fluid, fructose, that provides energy for the sperm. Okay, we've seen a picture of sperm before when we talked about our genetics, okay? We know that it has a head and a tail, and they kind of have this like swimming-like motion, okay? But this sugary fluid provides energy for this sperm so that they can kind of like go on the hunt for an egg. I guess I'm kind of lacking on some descriptive words here. But this sugary fluid is just like what you guys would eat. You guys eat carbs in your diet, breads, grains, fruits, vegetables, all of those are carbs. So is fructose, and this provides energy for the sperm. Okay, you maybe also heard that sperm can live, I think it's 4 to 6 days. So even after ejaculated, in the hopes of passing on genetic information, this sugary fluid allows for energy for that sperm to maintain their function, which is to pass on genetic information. The prostate gland secretes its products directly into the urethra through several small ducts. A small duct is kind of like a pore or like a little small sac. It produces an alkaline fluid to help buffer the acidic pH of the vagina. So the vagina has a specific pH, and maybe people have heard of like not throwing off that pH. What this alkaline fluid does is to help buffer that acidic pH of the vagina so that the sperm can survive, right? Because the sperm, they are not conscious, right? They just want to pass on genetic information. So the way that they can do that is by creating a lot of sperm, increasing their odds. Let's create some sugary fluid to help me survive for 4 to 6 days so I can also increase my odds. And let's buffer the acidic pH of the vagina so I can also survive and increase my odds of passing on my genetic information. The bulbourethral gland secretes a clear mucus before ejaculation that neutralizes the acidic urine remaining in the urethra, the mucus that acts as a lubricant. Because the penis is also used in the urinary tract, this is a way that it also kind of neutralizes the acidic of the urine that could still be remaining. So it's also, again, just kind of setting itself up for success here. Here's a more descriptive picture. This one's also in your book, I believe. This is just giving you a cross section or a different view of the male reproductive system. So you have that prostate gland here. Remember, it is the secretion of substances that become part of the semen. It's one of those accessory glands. And when we hear accessory gland, remember, you think of like an accessory that you would wear, like shoes or a bag or jewelry, okay? So an accessory kind of adds to it and it helps it out, right? The urethra here is what is essentially like the channel for ejaculation of the sperm. It has ducts that have dual functions. So those little ducts right there, that's what these are over here. They kind of blow that picture up for you on the left-hand side. On the top right, you have the ejaculatory duct. This is one of the pair of ducts through which the sperm travel to the penis here, which is kind of close to the prostate gland. You have the seminal vesicle. This is one of the pair of glands that secretes the fructose. Remember, that carbohydrate, essentially sugary fluid that essentially becomes part of the semen. The bulbourethral gland, one of the pair of the glands that secrete a lubricating mucus. Remember, that is the one that kind of neutralizes the urine. And then you have the vas deferens. This is one of the pair of ducts through which the sperm travel to the penis. The epididymis is just where they store the sperm. This is one of the pair of ducts in which sperm complete their maturing process, and part of the farthest from the testes to store the mature sperm. All right, and then you have the testes and the penis. The penis, obviously, we know is that male organ for sexual intercourse. The testes is then one of the pair of gonads packed with small sperm-producing tubes. the semi-inferior tubes and cells that secrete testosterone and other sex hormones. Also a fun fact, did you know that females, you maybe do know this, also produce testosterone? It's just that males do not produce estrogen. Naturally anyways. Reproductive organs, this is just a table, a nice picture that I didn't add, that was just there. It's just talking about those reproductive organs, how many there are, right? So you have one penis, but you have two testes. So that's what the two in parentheses means, because some things are parallel and on both sides. And then it just talks a little bit about the function on the right-hand side there. Okay. So what happens when the males essentially have the option to have a reproductive cycle? Okay, so what this looks like. There's increased blood flow that results in an erection. Okay, the reason this is so that sperm can travel through a series of ducts. All right, this is essentially how the sperm and the males are trying to pass on their genetic information. So they're trying to set up an optimal environment for the sperm, as well as the ability to possibly fertilize an egg. The accessory glands that empty into these ducts supply components of the semen. So remember, we talked about those accessory glands, the sugary substance, the buffering pH, and also the buffer for the urine. Those accessory organs are supplying those components of the semen. And then the testes secrete testosterone and produce sperm controlled by a feedback loop. We know what feedback loops are because we've talked about them in a previous class. We have negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops. Your negative feedback loop is like when you go outside and it's really hot and you start to sweat. Your body is correcting the initial stimulus, or the stimuli, which is that your body feels hot. So it creates like a wet moisture around the outside of your body that contains a little bit of salt. And when it dries, you guys all know that feeling when your sweat dries and you get really cold. That feeling is your body's way of correcting that stimuli. Another feedback loop is your positive feedback loop. This is where it's correcting whatever it is in one direction. So we talked about like during birth, the hormones that are essentially secreted to make sure that the baby is delivered. Okay, it's increasing contractions, dilating the cervix, things like that. It's all going in one direction because it just wants to correct that stimuli in one direction. Okay, I'll give you a little bit of a reminder here. So positive feedback loop. And I think of a negative feedback loop. Okay. So this is kind of the cycle in which a male wants to reproduce. Okay, the sexual response or the arousal reaction is that smooth muscle in the arteries of the penis relax. This is what is also called vasodilation, and an increased blood flow into the spongy tissue of the penis. The decreased blood flow leaving the penis due to the vein compression then results in an erection. Okay. There's something called erectile dysfunction. There's a lot of commercials about it on TV, right? This is where it can be because of a lot of different things. It can be genetics, it can be age, lots of other things. This is the inability to achieve or sustain an erectile suitable for intercourse, and it occurs when the erectile tissue does not expand enough to compress the veins, okay? Some treatment, you've probably seen some of the medications, like I said, on the commercials. I think of the one where the two people are sitting like in the bathtub in the middle of the woods or in the middle of the field. Also known as the little blue pill. You've got your Viagra, your Cialis, your Levitra. These are vasodilators that increase the blood flow to the penis when a man is sexually aroused, or a male. Okay. Sperm transport and semen contribution. Okay, so we know when we transport the semen, we've looked at pictures already, the testes, the vas deferens, and the urethra kind of all communicate and work together. The testes are made up of those coiled tubes called the semi-inferius tubes that pass the sperm into the epididymis, where the epididymis passes sperm to the vas deferens. Remember, the epididymis is where the sperm mature or go through that maturation process. The vas deferens, this is that longer tube. It's the seminal vesicle that contributes the sugar fluid. The vas deferens pass the semen to the urethra. Okay, so they're kind of all just connected to each other, communicating in a line here. The urethra then, it communicates with the prostate gland that contributes that alkaline fluid that is helping to buffer the acidity of the vagina, and the bulbourethral gland contributes alkaline mucus, and the urethra passes the semen out of the body. All right, a little bit more about hormone regulation of sperm formation. Okay, so there's this thing called the luteinizing hormone. You'll see it referred to as the LH, and this stimulates the production of testosterone. So when this hormone is kind of released from the brain, it stimulates testosterone, and when that increase of testosterone, it results in the testes to produce sperm. Okay, it does take about 2 to 3 months for sperm to mature. Another thing that we know about males is that their body can continue to make sperm after puberty for a longer period of time than a female is in reproductive age. It does slow down later in life, but it doesn't necessarily cease. When sperm can mature for 2 to 3 months, the body is producing that sperm. Okay, some of the effects of testosterone in males. At puberty, this testosterone is what helps with the secondary sex characteristics, so growth and development of all of those male reproductive organs happens, and the maintenance of their function. Testosterone is required for sex drive and sexual performance, and the andropause decrease testosterone, so it's slow a deterioration of the testicular function, so 1% decline a year after the age of 30. It's different for every individual, but essentially it doesn't cease like in menopause for females. If somebody has low testosterone, it can also be called hypogonadism, and it can be something that can happen because of this. It can be as a drop in sex drive, poor erections, low sperm count, even enlarged breasts. The treatment is to have testosterone replacement therapy, and there's some types of patches and injections that can help lead to increasing the production of testosterone in the body. Okay. Before we move on to the female reproductive anatomy, I kind of went through the male reproductive anatomy very fast. Does anybody have any questions? That's fine. Okay. All right, so what you do need to know about the male reproductive system is essentially the parts and what they do. This picture right here is super helpful, I think. Not only does it give you a visual, it kind of points to where things are located and gives you the structure and the function kind of relationship. Okay, that's important. And knowing maybe some of the dysfunctions. Those dysfunctions being erectile dysfunction and also low testosterone of the male reproductive system. Okay, so now we're moving on to the female reproductive anatomy. We're going to kind of go through the same process. We're going to list the structure and functions. It's a little bit different here because we're explaining an ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. And we're going to discuss levels of hormones during the ovarian and uterine cycles. Okay. So again, we're located near that pelvic girdle. Okay. Some of the main components of that female reproductive system are the urinary, well, not the urinary bladder, the uterus, ovary, and vagina. The urinary bladder is just located in a similar spot to the male and the female reproductive system, so that's why it's located there. Just as a reminder, your urinary bladder is not a part of your reproductive system. It's part of the urinary system, even though maybe some of the parts are in the organs are used for both. Okay, so the female reproductive anatomy, the external, so we talked about the external versus internal with male reproductive organs. Female external reproductive structures include the clitoris and the vulva. The clitoris is an erectile organ, and the vulva are the two sets of the labia. Okay, some of the external genitalia of the female reproductive system. You have the mons pubis at the top there, the labia majora. Some of these have been crossed off, but you also have the clitoris, the urethral afferents, the vagina afferents, the labia minora, and the perineum and the anus. So these are all of the external genitalia of the female reproductive system. Okay. This is probably the picture that you most likely saw in like your high school science classes or health classes of the female reproductive system. Okay, most people refer to the female reproductive system as the vagina, but technically most of the female reproductive system is taken up by the uterus. You also have your ovaries, your oviduct, and your cervix. When a female or an individual with a uterus is pregnant, you talk about like, oh, the cervix is dilated. Well, it's not just like the big opening on the bottom. So that's another misconception. The cervix is located superior to the vagina. The uterus is made up of the uterine wall and the endometrium. And inside of the ovaries, you have follicles and the corpus luteum. And we'll talk about what those mean in just a little bit. All right, so the egg, which we've been talking about, is not like a chicken's egg. The ovaries, oviducts, and the uterus. So the egg is released from the ovary into the abdominal cavity near the opening of the oviduct or the fallopian tube. So if you go back here, this is the ovary, this is the oviduct and the fallopian tube. So even though it's not labeled. So when an egg is released, it goes down that fallopian tube. Cilia in the tube convey the egg to the uterus. We've seen that word cilia before. Those are those hair-like projections. They're not really hair. They look like little fingers. They are there to help kind of move things along. We've talked about those cilia before, but in this case, they help convey the egg to the uterus. The uterus is a chamber where the embryo develops. Okay, so the egg's main goal is to also pass on genetic information. The egg's main goal is to be fertilized by a sperm cell. And the uterus acts as a chamber where this fertilized embryo can develop. The lining is called the endometrium. The cervix is an opening to the uterus that dilates during childbirth, which I talked about a little bit. And you'll see that in movies sometimes, where they're like, oh, the person's dilated to whatever centimeters. My mom always, well, I have not had a child, but my mom always says that the movies really kind of overdo what actually is, what it's like, but everybody's different. The vagina is a thin-walled chamber that is a repository for sperm during copulation. We talked about how most people refer to the female reproductive system as the vagina, which is kind of true, but not. We all know now that there's more parts to the female reproductive system. It also serves as the birth canal in which the baby could be born. All right, here's a similar picture to what we saw on the male side of the reproductive system. We talked about your ovary, which is where the egg is released from. It's described here as a gonad, which is similar to the male reproductive testes. This is where the oocytes and the sex hormones are produced. These hormones work on a monthly basis. They stimulate an oocyte to mature and the corpus luteum, the glandular structure, to form and prime the uterine lining for potential pregnancy. Okay, so the egg's main goal or its main function is to pass on genetic information. So essentially every month the ovary is thinking, this is it. We're going to we're going to pass on our genetic information this time. We're going to get prepared. And then it goes down the oviduct, which is faciliated channels, so cilia, those hair-like, finger-like projections, through which the oocytes are propelled from an ovary to the uterus, the usual site of fertilization. The uterus, like we've talked about here in a little bit, is that chamber in which the embryo has the possibility of developing in. Its narrowed portion, the cervix, secretes mucus that helps the sperm travel into the uterus and defends the embryo against many bacteria. So this mucus can help prevent bacteria from getting into the uterus and damaging or affecting, essentially, the embryo. You can see that the urinary bladder is also located near the reproductive system, but we do know that the urinary bladder is part of the urinary system. The urethra is where the urinary tract ends and expels through the out of the body. You have the myometrium, which is the thick muscle layers of the uterus that stretch greatly during pregnancy. That's up here kind of by the uterus, as well as the endometrium, which is that inner lining of the uterus. And this is where the blastocyte implants itself, gets thicker and has an increased blood supply during pregnancy and gives rise to maternal portion of the placenta, an organ that metabolically supports the embryonic and fetal development. So if you've ever heard of the placenta before, it stems from the endometrium. The clitoris is kind of located here at the front. This is the small organ that is responsive to sexual stimulation. The labia minora and majora are the pair of the outermost fat padded skin folds that are part of the genitalia. They help with protection against infection. And then vagina is that organ of sexual intercourse, also used as the birth canal. So you've probably heard of mammary glands before. The mammary glands are not a part of the reproductive system because they don't aid in reproduction, but they are important to reproduction because for mammals, in this case, they secrete epithelial tissues, the epithelial tissues that secrete milk. So while this doesn't aid in reproduction, it's not considered part of the reproductive system. So if you were to put mammary glands on the exam under reproductive system, it'd technically be wrong because it's not a part of the reproductive system, but it aids the reproductive system because it's important for secretion of milk, especially in mammals. Actually, only in mammals. That's why we're called mammals. Female reproductive organs. Here's that table that's really helpful, 39.2 from your book. Human female reproductive organs. On the left-hand side is the organ and how many there are. So that's why there's 2 in parentheses. And then on the right, you can see just some of their functions, which we've already talked about. All right. So the reproductive cycle in females. Okay. So now we have a female who the body wants to go through a reproductive cycle. So the secretions of hormones and the reproductive events they regulate are cyclic, or in a cycle or a circle. The 2 types of cycles occur in female mammals. You have the menstrual cycle and the estrous cycle, and they're different. Okay. Humans and other primates have menstrual cycles, while other mammals have estrous cycles. In both cases, the ovulation occurs at a time in this cycle and after the endometrium has started to thicken in preparation for implantation of essentially of an embryo or a zygote. Okay, can anybody think of a mammal that goes through an estrous cycle? Maybe some of you have had this mammal in your house. Cat, yeah, cat, dog. Those are some of the types of mammals that go through an estrous cycle, where humans and primates is another species that we're related to, have menstrual cycles. Okay, so the difference between a menstrual cycle and an estrous cycle: in a menstrual cycle, the endometrium is shed from the uterus in bleeding called menstruation. Some people call it the period. Sexual receptivity is not limited to a specific time frame. Okay, but you've maybe heard of an animal being in heat before. This is when sexual receptivity is limited to a heat period. That's when the endometrium is reabsorbed by the uterus, and essentially it's a time in which it can reproduce. Whereas with the menstrual cycles, that sexual receptivity or reproductive cycle is not limited to a specific time frame. The female reproductive cycle is one that is integrated cycle, involves mainly two organs. Your I say your, as in the hypothetical person, ovaries and the uterus. The ovarian cycle, so each ovary contains many follicles. A follicle consists of one egg that is surrounded by one or more layers of these follicle cells. And one follicle, it matures each month from puberty until menopause, okay? These follicles, or these cells, were essentially already established in the female baby when it was born, but the maturing of these follicles happens one per month post-puberty. The ovulation and the monthly release of the egg from the ovary when a follicle ruptures. So this is called ovulation, that monthly release of the egg. And then after ovulation, the remaining follicular tissue transforms into the corpus luteum. So here's another picture of this. This is where you would start here on number 1. I know it can kind of be hard to see at the front, but you do have this picture in your book. A primary follicle contains an oocyte and begins producing the sex hormone estrogen. So the fun fact of the day was that females do produce testosterone naturally, but males do not produce estrogen naturally, okay? So because of this sex hormone estrogen, the secondary follicle, so now we're kind of zoomed in on this ovary here, it contains a secondary oocyte and produces the sex hormones estrogen and some progesterone. Okay, here's a little bit more real life picture that's not a cartoon, zoomed in on this oocyte. The vesicular follicle develops, and then for ovulation, the secondary oocyte is released. It's released down the oviduct or the fallopian tube. The corpus luteum produces the sex hormones progesterone and some estrogen. So we're producing a lot of estrogen and progesterone, and the corpus luteum degenerates. So this is kind of that cycle right there that is happening monthly. Okay, this graph here shows the hormones in the ovarian and menstrual cycles, okay? So across the bottom is the day, okay, so the days of the cycle, essentially. So you can see day 1 through 27, and then you see after 27 that it starts over at 1, because this is a cycle, okay? So essentially on day 1 of this cycle, of the ovarian cycle, the developing follicle matures into a follicle around day 1 to 9, 7 to 9, okay? Depends on the individual, it depends on the month, it depends on stress levels, other hormone levels, etc. Then you have ovulation, which is anywhere between, it says 13 through 15, it can be 11 to almost 17, it just depends. Ovulation is occurring. You can see that the hormone levels somewhat are steady through this maturing phase, but then ovulation, those hormone levels kind of go up. You can see that peak here. And then after ovulation, you have the luteal phase, which is the early corpus luteum and the regressing corpus luteum, and you see that those hormone levels go back down, okay? The uterine, or also known as the menstrual cycle, it says cycle after cycle, the maturation and the release of the egg from the ovary are integrated with changes in the uterus. If fertilization does not occur, because the egg's main goal is the passing on of the genetic information, the corpus luteum degenerates, and the menstrual fluid flows out of the vagina, and the cycle starts again. So this is kind of called the period or the menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycles, says about 450, so on average, I guess average is subjective, continue until a woman's fertility ends at menopause, And then it's the cessation of the ovulation and the menstruation, which is different than in males, whereas the production of sperm kind of degrades 1% every year after the age of 30, where after menstruation it is no longer possible for a female to reproduce. This is a little breakdown of that uterine cycle, the 28-day cyclic event in the uterus. So days 1 through 5, days 6 through 13, day 14, days 15 through 28. Okay, so days 1 through 5, we talked about that there's low levels of estrogen and progesterone. We saw that in the graph, and it causes the inner uterine lining to disintegrate and the menstruation occurs. Days 6 through 13 is an increase in the estrogen, causes the endometrium to thicken, and ovulation occurs then on day 14. And day 15 through 28 is an increase in the progesterone, causes the endometrium to double or triple its thickness in preparation to develop an embryo. But if the embryo doesn't get fertilized or the egg does not get fertilized, then the corpus luteum regresses and the endometrium breaks down. And then the cycle repeats itself. So the second part of this graph here, we already went through the top part, but the second part of the graph is that same 27 days, but now we're looking at what the endometrium does and how the hormone levels are kind of regulated. So you can see there's a couple different things here. So you have ovarian events, so what's going on in the ovary, and now you have what's going on in the endometrium, or that lining of the uterus. So in the uterine cycle, days 1 through 9, essentially, and you can see kind of close towards day 10 and 11, but 1 through 9, the estrogen and the progesterone are kind of considered low. Right? The menstruation is happening here, days 1 through 5. Proliferative phase, then here you have ovulation, which is the same up here. And then the secondary phase, where the endometrium, the lining thickens. You can see that there's also another spike of progesterone and a smaller spike but of the estrogen, but it does go down a little bit. This cycle then repeats. So what does estrogen do to the female body? Well, at puberty, it produces the secondary sex characteristics, the growth of the ovaries and the follicles. At menopause, which is kind of the stop or the stop of production of menstruation, is a decrease in the estrogen and the progesterone. Some kind of effects of menopause or some side effects would be hot flashes, an increase in bone loss, and a thinning and drying of the vaginal lining. Okay, this is just something that was added in the PowerPoint. You don't need to go through it if you want to, you can sure try. But then these are also something that we can work through together here, or you can do it on your own. The description of the event and what letter corresponds with that. So the uterus lining is thickening and waiting for a fertilized egg. The uterus lining begins to gradually thicken up again. The egg is released by the ovary. The released egg is traveling down the fallopian tube to be fertilized. The thick lining of the uterus breaks down and flows out slowly, and then a woman is fertile during this period only. So there's A, B, C, D, and there's also another A there. If you wanted to work through that on your own, or we could do it together, whatever you guys want. On your own? No, yes. Okay, on your own. Sounds good. Does anybody have any questions about the reproductive systems of males and females? That's okay. Hopefully you know at least 50% of this, right? That's the goal. Whatever 50% you are. Okay. Good. Well, that's all I have formally for you. If you have any questions, let me know. We'll see you on lab on Wednesday. And if you need to, I believe the instructions for lab are online if you'd like to look ahead and see what we're doing.